In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa walked into the street and started dancing. She didn't stop, not after an hour, not after a day, not after a week. She danced without food, without water, without rest. Her feet bled through her shoes, and still she danced. Within days, others joined her, then dozens. Then, by some accounts, over 400 people were dancing in the streets of Strasbourg, completely against their will, and no one could explain why. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518. And 500 years later, we still don't have a definitive answer for what actually happened. To understand what happened, you first need to understand where it happened and why the people of Strasbourg were already at their breaking point. It was 1518. The Holy Roman Empire was fracturing. The Protestant Reformation was just beginning to tear Europe apart. And Strasbourg, a wealthy trading city on the Rhine, was suffering through what historians describe as one of the worst series of disasters in its recorded history. Syphilis had swept through the population. Harvests had failed for multiple consecutive years. Famine was spreading through the lower classes. And a particularly severe winter had left thousands of residents homeless and destitute. The people of Strasbourg were by every measure desperate, terrified, and searching for answers in a world that seemed to have abandoned them. Then, in mid-July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophäa, a peasant woman about whom we know almost nothing, stepped out of her home on a narrow street and began to dance. Historical records, including physician reports, city council notes, and church sermons from the time, confirm what happened next with unusual specificity for the era. She danced for 4 to 6 days straight. By the end of the first week, she had been joined by roughly 34 other residents. Within a month, the dancing had spread to somewhere between 50 and 400 people. The historical accounts vary significantly. Some danced for days, some for weeks, and a number of them, according to contemporary sources, died from heart failure, exhaustion, and stroke. The city of Strasbourg was watching its citizens dance themselves to death, and no one knew how to stop it. Here is where the story gets significantly stranger, because the response of Strasbourg's authorities was, by any modern measure, completely insane. The city council consulted with local physicians, and the physicians, working within the medical framework of the time, concluded that the dancing was caused by hot blood. They recommended treatment, more dancing. The council cleared out 2 guild halls and the horse market to give the dancers more room. They hired professional musicians to play continuously. They even brought in some of the city's most skilled dancers to join the afflicted, on the theory that dancing through the crisis would eventually exhaust the hot blood from the body. Think about what that means. The city watched its residents dance themselves toward death and decided the solution was to hire a band. Predictably, the number of dancers grew. The music continued, and the deaths began to mount. Within weeks, the church reversed the council's position entirely. Local clergy declared that the plague was a divine punishment, specifically the wrath of Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr whose feast day was associated, curiously, with dancing. The dancers were transported by wagon to the shrine of Saint Vitus in Saverne, roughly 40 kilometres away. There, priests performed rituals over the afflicted. They were given red shoes, special masses were held, and according to historical records, the dancing largely stopped. Whether this represents a genuine cure, a placebo effect at population scale, or simply the exhaustion of the original sufferers, we cannot say. But the outbreak appears to have ended within approximately 2 months of when it began. Frau Trophäa, the woman who started it all, disappears from the historical record entirely. We have no account of what happened to her. Here is the detail that most people don't know, and the one that makes this story genuinely unsettling. The dancing plague of 1518 was not a unique event. It was the largest and most thoroughly documented instance of what historians call a dancing mania. But the historical record contains at least 10 other outbreaks, stretching back to at least 1021 across Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and France. In 1374, a mass dancing outbreak swept through multiple cities simultaneously along the Rhine Valley, with thousands of participants. In 1237, a group of children in Erfurt were reportedly compelled to dance continuously for miles through the countryside. In 1278, 200 people danced on a bridge over the River Meuse until it collapsed beneath them. Whatever was happening in 1518 had been happening on and off for centuries, and no one had been able to stop it. 5 centuries of scholarship have produced 3 serious theories for what happened in Strasbourg. The first, and the one most accepted by modern historians, is mass psychogenic illness. The argument, advanced most comprehensively by historian John Waller in his 2009 study of the outbreak, goes like this. The population of Strasbourg in 1518 was under extreme psychological stress. The famine, the disease, the religious upheaval. In communities under this level of chronic terror, the human mind is capable of producing involuntary physical symptoms at a population level. The dancing was, in this framework, a collective breakdown. There is precedent for this. Modern medical literature documents dozens of cases of mass psychogenic illness, from the laughing epidemic in Tanzania in 1962 to the Halifax slasher panic in England in 1938, to documented cases in modern schools and factories where symptoms spread from person to person with no physical cause. The human mind, under sufficient pressure, can make the body do extraordinary things. And in 1518, the minds of Strasbourg were under pressure that most of us cannot imagine. The second theory involves something considerably more disturbing and considerably more physical. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains during periods of cold, wet weather. Precisely the conditions that existed in the Rhine Valley in the years preceding 1518. When consumed, ergot contains compounds chemically related to LSD. Its effects include convulsions, muscle spasms, hallucinations, and, critically, involuntary rhythmic movement that can resemble dancing. Ergot poisoning, known historically as St. Anthony's fire, has been proposed as an explanation for other historical mass hysteria events, including, controversially, the Salem witch trials. The theory holds that contaminated grain supplies triggered neurological episodes across the afflicted population simultaneously. The argument against it? Ergotism typically also produces gangrene and extreme pain, symptoms conspicuously absent from the 1518 accounts. And ergot poisoning doesn't explain why the dancing was specifically social, why people dance together in public rather than convulsing alone. The third theory is the one historians are most reluctant to engage with, because it requires taking the belief system of medieval Strasbourg seriously on its own terms. Saint Vitus was a 3rd century martyr who, according to legend, was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil and survived by dancing. His feast day, June 15th, fell just weeks before the outbreak began. In Alsatian folk religion, Saint Vitus was simultaneously a healer and a bringer of dancing curses upon those who sinned against him. Some researchers, including historian Ramsay MacMullen, have argued that the dancing wasn't entirely involuntary, that at least some participants entered a deliberate religious trance state, a form of ecstatic worship that provided psychological relief from unbearable conditions. That the plague was, in part, a coping mechanism that the terrified population of Strasbourg invented for itself. And that the religious authorities, by taking it seriously and providing the pilgrimage to Saverne, inadvertently provided the resolution the community needed. In this reading, the dancing was not a disease, it was a prayer, the most desperate kind, made with the whole body, because words had already failed. We don't know what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. We may never know. But there is something about this story that I find genuinely difficult to let go of. Not the ergot, not the psychogenic theory, not even the religious dimension. It's this. 500 years later, the medical definition of a mass psychogenic illness is still essentially a large number of people experience real symptoms for reasons we cannot explain. We've given it a clinical name. We've filed it in medical journals. But we haven't answered the underlying question, which is, what does it mean that human beings, under sufficient pressure, can lose voluntary control of their own bodies? That the line between what the mind does to the body and what the body does on its own is far thinner than we like to believe. The people of Strasbourg weren't weak. They weren't irrational. They were terrified, starving, and desperate. And something happened to them that we, with 5 centuries of medical science, still cannot fully account for. The archive is full of stories like this one. Stories that were buried, not because they weren't real, but because they were too strange to fit into the version of history we preferred to tell ourselves. If you want to go deeper, the primary historical source for this event is John Waller's 2009 book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die. It's one of the most meticulously researched accounts of the outbreak that exists. I'll leave a link in the description. If this is the kind of history that interests you, the forgotten, the strange, the stories that didn't make it into the textbooks, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe. There's a great deal more in the archive. Next week we open a different file. One that starts with a dead man on a beach, a scrap of Persian poetry, and a code that took 70 years to crack.